Hey there, thank you for joining us. I'm excited to bring you the next in our ongoing webinar series focused on critical SOF issues. Today's webinar, SOF Experience with Linguists, Understanding and Navigating the Human Domain. With thousands of linguists and analysts deployed supporting our troops worldwide, Mission Essential has a deep vested interest in this topic. We believe authentic linguistic and cultural understanding are key components of global security today. The type and diversity of threats demand ongoing development, application, and training in the arena of language services. For some context, Mission Essential is the largest provider of language services to DoD. 100,000 missions, 20,000 linguists in 83 countries. We hope that this conversation will inform and inspire you. Today, we're privileged to have Mike Kershner moderate our session. With over 27 years of active service in infantry and special forces, he commanded at every level of Special Forces Group, including Group Command. He has an extensive joint background experience and is highly experienced in tactical, operational, and strategic levels of special operations, as well as the linguistic elements impacting each. Mike currently serves as the president of Cape Fox Federal Integrators. Welcome, Mike, and panel. Thank you for being with us today and for your service. Mike, the con is yours.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm honored today to be here and truly humbled to be in the presence of such great guys. This is a wonderful opportunity for me. I'd like to introduce my panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Colonel Andy Milburn, born in Hong Kong, grew up in the UK, went to the University College of London. After graduating law school, he enlisted in the Marine Corps as a private, truly a barracks lawyer, commissioned from the ranks, and worked in both Marine infantry and special operations. He's commanded at every grade, and as a commanding officer of the Marine Special Operations Regiment, he was selected to head a multinational task force against ISIS in Iraq. Retired in 2019 as the Chief of Staff for SOCCENT, Central Special Operations Command Central. And since then, he has written a number of articles on such topics as leadership ethics and cultural change. Has a new book out on the shelves, When the Tempest Gathers, From Mogadishu to the Fight Against ISIS, a Marine Special Operations Commander at War. I recommend that you get it if you don't already have it on your shelf. And he is married to the lovely Jessica. They live in Tampa, Florida with their 2 children and a whole bunch of rescued dogs. Dave Maxwell is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He is a 30-year veteran of Special Forces in the U.S. Army. He and I used to work together in Special Forces, so we go way back. His final assignment was serving on the military faculty at the National War College, teaching national security strategy. Dave served a whole bunch of command and staff assignments in the infantry as well as Special Forces. He has a total of 20 years of service in Asia alone. A lot of work with the United Nations Command and with the Special United States Forces Korea. He also commanded 1st Battalion, 1st Special Forces Group, and was a G3 and Chief of Staff of the Army Special Operations Command. He commanded the Joint Special Operations Task Force in the Philippines from 2006 to 2007. He's a fellow and a member of the board of directors at about 15 different committees, many of which have to do with Korea policy, and is currently pursuing his doctorate of liberal studies at Georgetown, writing his dissertation, The Statesman, the Strategist, and the Special Forces Soldier, a philosophy of unconventional and political warfare, subject of great interest to all of us. So, Dave, I would like to give you a chance to, why don't you I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes. You can tell us something I haven't already told us about you, and then Andrew, I'd ask you to do the same.
Well, thank you, Mike, and also welcome to Andrew. And I also commend Andrew's book to everyone. It's well worth the read. I'd just like to say that, as I think about SOF in great power competition in support of the national security strategy, I really think of 2 SOF trinities. The first is SOF has to participate in irregular warfare, conduct unconventional warfare, and provide support to the national level mission of political warfare. And the second SOF trinity are really the comparative advantages of SOF, which are really 3: influence, governance, and support to indigenous forces and populations. And I mention that because that really ties into our topic today, because obviously cultural understanding, cultural awareness, cultural respect is really dependent on language and linguists. And, in my experience in Asia, there are so many languages, no one can be competent. You're lucky to be competent in one language, let alone all the various languages that exist. And I would say that as we look at great power competition, and our national security strategy posits our major enemies as five, the revisionist powers, China and Russia, the rogue states of Iran and North Korea, and the continued fight against violent extremist organizations. But too many people, I think, focus on great power conflict as if we're going to fight a war between China and Russia, which we absolutely must prepare for. And by preparing for it, hopefully will deter. But the point I think we really need to focus on is that we're going to face China and Russia in places other than the geographic locations of China and Russia. Just as an example, the One Belt, One Road, China is extending its network around the world. And our State Department has initiated the Blue Dot Network, which is really an infrastructure development project that really counters One Belt, One Road. And I would posit that those are locations where we really need to be prepared to employ special operations to work through, with, and by indigenous countries, forces, and populations to further our interest, protect our values, and really help our friends, partners, and allies against the revisionist, authoritarian government of China, who seeks to export their authoritarian regime ways. And so I really think it's important for us not to focus specifically on Russia and China, but to focus on the areas where we might meet: Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Europe. And to do that, we've got to be culturally aware, culturally knowledgeable, and whether we can speak a language or not, have the cultural respect that comes with developing relationships and living and working with our friends, partners, and allies. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dave. Andrew? You're on mute, Andrew.
Yeah, sorry about that. So oldest trick in the book. Mike, when you said that, I thought you wanted to hear about, the fact that I was almost a competitive ice skater or some other, but Dave started off on absolutely the right foot, and actually covered, I think, the last point of discussion that we're going to have, and he did it far better than I can, which is, regardless of great power competition, the way that we, especially SOF, our battleground, and I hate to use this term, but in the gray zone, is going to be in third countries. I didn't say third world countries necessarily, I meant third countries, and where, our knowledge of culture and language is again going to be the imperative. But rather than restate what Dave said, that's what I had lined up to say, really, not the ice skating thing, but rather than restate what Dave said so well, I want to come in on another angle, and this is, I think, and no one's paid me to say this, but it's a point, something that I've learned over the years, and it's based on some hard lessons on the conventional side. When we first went into Iraq, and of course, my frame of reference was at the time Marine infantry, we thought we went to great effort in learning about Iraqi culture. The usual cliches: don't point your feet at people, don't eat with your left hand, et cetera, et cetera. It was, I won't say wasted, but the paradox was this: we spent a lot of time learning that, but then we ended up shooting innocent people at checkpoints over and over again, which I think, which I can't, we'd like to say that other things contributed to the burgeoning insurgency at the time, but there's no doubt about it that our inability to understand local culture contributed to it too. Well, where am I heading on this? Okay, giving just classes on culture itself was not enough. But what I learned during my second and third deployments, when I deployed as an advisor and then as an infantry battalion commander, was an interesting point. If you get your guys, or encourage your guys, or even a percentage of your guys, and you give them an incentive and they learn the language, they get cultural insights that you can't possibly pass to them any other way. And yes, I know the difficulty of teaching everyone to learn language. That's not my point. Even if you have one guy in a squad, it's a very interesting dynamic takes place. The fact that he can establish communication he has learned that language, means that suddenly the rest of that squad see the locals as being peers and human beings. And it was never as simple as that, simply that, hey, we're Americans, we can shoot who we want. But because there was the language divide, what followed was this dangerously implicit understanding that we can do whatever we want to protect our lives or in collective self-defense, even if it meant killing innocent people. Not in as straight terms as that, but once we started teaching language, ensuring that some of our guys spoke that language, it was very interesting how that cultural dynamic changed, and everyone within the unit started to get insights into the local population that they previously had not had. And you just have to look at statistics and for instance, in Iraq, and the number of innocent people who were killed in situations where rules of engagement were perhaps applied overzealously. People were very quick to pull the trigger on the theory of self-defense. All that dynamic changed. A lot of it was leadership, a lot of it was accountability, but a huge part of it was this understanding that was gained by enforcing learning language. And I'm talking about conventional units. My experience of SOF units is that's had an exponential effect, of course. And I'm sorry, I'm talking a little longer than your 3 minutes. But I want to throw something else in the dynamic when you get to, when we're talking about SOF units that really, really benefits us. And forgive me for using that collective term, but that is that regardless of service, there's an element of emotional intelligence involved in our assessment process, whether it's Marines or SF. And with that goes curiosity and empathy. And so the ability to learn about culture, learn about language is exponentially increased. And it goes beyond those simple classes. When we deployed to Iraq last time, my guys wanted to learn about the Kurds. They wanted to learn the background of Iraq. It was enforced down at E6 level. It's hard to prove a negative, but the ability for the Marines, sailors, and soldiers at team level to walk a very, very delicate balance between Kurds, Shia militia, Iraqis, Sunni tribesmen, which they had to do every day, was truly impressive. But again, it came back to the drive, the enthusiasm to learn language and culture.
And speaking of language and culture, I want to go back to one of the basics here. What is language and culture? I mean, in Europe, I spent a long time in the 10th SF group, and one of my charges was language training. What languages do you focus on in Europe? What languages do you train your people on in Europe? And particularly after the wall came down, now the focus has changed. Now I've got another facet of the diamond I got to look at for languages. You go to Africa and the number of languages is absolutely staggering. It changes at the riverside. Guys who think they speak Spanish go to Uruguay and they can speak to the Uruguayans, but then they listen to Uruguayans talk to each other and they don't have a clue what they're saying because they're speaking a patois of Indian language and Spanish and culture. Sipping tea in the right way, not using your left hand. At what level is culture trained, and how do you translate that? How do you do that in a large scale, particularly when we're talking about, we don't know where we're going to be in the next confrontation. I mean, as Dave points out, the Belt and Road Initiative has kind of enlarged the scope of where we might in fact encounter our enemies. How do we train them culturally and in language? How do we train for that? Andrew? You're on mute.
It's my language faux pas right off the bat. So I'm not just saying this because Dave and I are, and you have a background in SOF, but I think everything you said, again, just emphasizes the important role that SOF plays going ahead even in great power competition, because as you said, we don't necessarily know where the next venue is going to be. Notice I didn't say battle space or battleground, the venue for a competition in that realm. And whoever deploys there is going to have to learn these things very quickly. And as we already talked about, these things aren't simply learning the mechanisms of cultural obedience, such as, you know, the cliches we just talked about, the eating with your hand. They're about mindset, right? You know, I'll give you an example. And this is what I kind of realized that where language led us is that learning about the Iraqis, for instance, didn't mean the superficial trappings of their culture. It meant learning about where they came from and their mindset, what was important to them. And so, for instance, we as Americans tend to be idealists. We can afford to be idealists. You know, it's, I don't know if it's somewhere in the hierarchy of needs, but we're at a point where, you know, how many times have you heard this? Things like loyalty, concepts like loyalty mean a lot to us, and because we can afford to adhere to them. But for the average Iraqi, whether under Saddam or in the immediate aftermath, survival was all important. Security was all important. Looking after your family was all important. And that trumped any of the things that we thought were important, such as loyalty and such as idealism. And how many times did you hear, you know, you hear Americans feel let down by their Iraqi counterpart or their partner because he said he was going to do something, but he did not. And it was simply through, you know, it wasn't, in his eyes, he wasn't committing some kind of egregious sin of breached loyalty. It was because his values came down to pragmatism and survival of himself, survival of the family, and that trumped everything. That's just an example. Now, that outlook is quite common in many parts of the world for obvious reasons. So to understand that does take an emotional intelligence. It's very easy to understand the trappings of each culture. But what I just talked about is a kind of a universality of culture in many places where we deploy. And our guys, when I say our guys, I mean soft guys, by and large, tend to have empathy and understand that right off the bat. We still make mistakes. However much we still want to fall in love with our partner nation force and believe that they're driven by higher level sense of idealism instead of just simply pragmatism. But nevertheless, understanding that we have to seek the shaded area on that Venn diagram. We can't appeal to the fact that Islamic State is bad, and that they need to be on our side because we're the guys wearing the white hats. We have to look for why they would want to do it. What is in it for them? Does that make sense? Who does that best? You know, we make mistakes. Soft guys make that mistake all the time, but we are better attuned to that. I think it's a very hard struggle for conventional forces, and I'll shut up in a moment, Mike. But I think honestly, you know, when you guys, when I say you guys, you Army guys, when you have some concerns about the SFAPs, I don't think it's prejudice. I don't think it's, you know, green beret jingoism, although there's plenty of that. You know, in truth, it's the understanding that that the emotional intelligence is a huge part of this, and you can't inculcate that in a short course. Most of us are either born with it or we aren't. Sorry, Mike, over lengthy answer again.
Okay, I'll mute you from now on. Dave.
Yeah, well, let me echo Andrew's points. I mean, they're excellent, and I'll try to build on them. You know, first, I think one of the things that soft selection, you know, across our services, that we do a good job on, whether a soldier or sailor, airman, Marine understands it, well, particularly soldiers and Marines, I think our selection tries to find people who want to live and work in foreign cultures. They've got a natural affinity towards that. And some people don't know that they have that, but I think our selection process does a good job of finding those people. And I think that's a really inherent part of our selection process. And so I think that does help SOF in a lot of ways. But I mentioned three things: cultural awareness, cultural understanding, and cultural respect. And I think I look at cultural awareness as what you both described about taking classes, learning all the trappings, not, the bottom of your feet, not eating with your left hand, all those things. And, that we're trying to make people culturally aware. And that's important. It's part of respect, but it is not the end all be all. And we really need to have cultural understanding. And that really comes through learning the language. And so, all of us can't learn the language of the target country. Andrew's exactly right. To have one or two people that really understand the language, that's a game changer. That's a real force multiplier. But that is what really allows you to have cultural understanding. And so if you can't speak the language, you're really dependent on those who can, and those might be linguists. And it's really important that you work with them to really gain that understanding, through your linguist. And you've got to develop that. Now, cultural respect, though, you can have with or without language. And that's respecting, that's fundamentally respecting people, the dignity of the human being, whether you can speak the language or not. And that's important. But if you don't speak the language, we tend to fall into some biases. The first one is that we tend to think that those who can't speak English are not as smart as we are. And, I think that's just a natural bias. And because they can't seem to communicate in our language, that they are not as, an intellectual equal to us. And of course, I think we all know that that is a huge mistake. And so we've got to respect everyone. The other aspect is that we tend to fall into this trap is that if someone does speak English, then they are smart and that they are the natural leader. And I think we often fall into, and I see this especially with negotiations with North Korea, the person you're negotiating with, if they speak the language, they may not be in charge. And again, this goes back to how a linguist and how somebody who speaks the language can really help you, because they can identify where the real power is. And you can only do that through language. And so it's really, really important to understand that, where the power lies, who the leaders are, the formal leaders and the informal leaders. And it really takes language to do that. In terms of respect, I jokingly say I've insulted more cultures, around the world, and we insult, we do something wrong. I've found that as long as you are respectful, are willing to learn from your mistakes, that it's not it doesn't mean mission failure. I think we tend to think of when we learn the cultural trappings that if you do something wrong, that's going to end everything. I think that most of the indigenous people that we work with don't expect us to be experts in their culture, and while we can demonstrate the trappings of the culture, that shows that we've taken it upon ourselves to invest time in trying to understand them. But the trap that we often fall into is, the pejorative term going native. And we do this from the highest level. And what I mean by that is, I've often been asked by counterparts, why is it that you sacrifice your culture and your values for us? For example, we tend to go to places and we automatically implement General Order Number 1. We won't drink. Well, that's an American custom. And we do it, of course, we say to respect, a religion or a culture, that might not imbibe in alcohol. But, they often question us, why are you giving up your culture? Why aren't you doing your, what Americans always do? And I think that that's a very good point, is that, we've got to strike that balance between respecting culture, but not sacrificing our values. And I would tell you that that sometimes indigenous forces, when they look at us sacrificing our own values, they look at us a little strangely. Well, if we can sacrifice our values, that means they must not be very important to them, to us as Americans. Now, I'm not saying that alcohol is a value, but it's a custom, and it's something that we tend to think about. And of course, our allied partners, especially from Europe, they look at us with a raised eyebrow or two when we choose not to imbibe when it's offered. And so I just mentioned that because I think we have to really understand our relationship with our counterparts, with our own values. But in the end, cultural awareness, cultural understanding, cultural respect are key. And cultural respect is most important. But as I said, we've really got to have language to have cultural understanding. And it only comes through language. I'll stop there.
Hey, Mike, can I jump in real quick?
No.
Dave's, you say go or no?
I said no.
Oh.
Go ahead, yeah.
Dave made a superb point that I want to pile in on. And it wasn't just about alcohol being a value, although it has assumed a disproportionate value during the COVID isolation. But I digress. No, what Dave's point is spot on. Striking that balance between having empathy for another culture, but not losing what your partner nation may value in your culture. Great point. And I'll give you a quick example, and not to go native. My second tour as an advisor in Iraq, a very interesting dynamic happened. We had a U.S. lieutenant colonel who, subscribed to the belief, because he'd been taught this, that Arabs never get straight to the point, right? So in meetings, you just ramble and talk about families and this and that. And our Iraqi partners got tremendously frustrated with us. And I remember once saying, hey, we need you guys. We had problems with this ourselves. We need you guys to be able to do this. My dog's interrupting me, so there you go, Mike. So yeah, absolutely a terrific point, but it's a balance, isn't it? Striking that balance, having that empathy, but at the same time, not losing the things that make you effective in that environment.
And all three of us have worked in environments where language is so important, being able to understand what other people are saying, the art of using a translator. That is a skill set in and of itself, using an interpreter and understanding what the benefits and limitations of that interpreter can be, and how they can affect the way that you're going about your job. As we look at that and the importance of language, how do we balance culture and language? Do we emphasize culture and cultural understanding and cultural respect, or do we emphasize the language with the cultural and cultural respect coming with it? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? That's just as a talking point, if you will. Dave?
I think it comes down to two things. First is aptitude and desire. For someone to be a linguist, they've got to have the natural aptitude to learn a language. And of course, us old guys, it's harder to do that. The older you are, and in fact, even a recruit, an 18-year-old recruit is at a disadvantage if you're starting out learning a language. So you've got to have the aptitude, and then you got to have the desire. There are those that have the aptitude but couldn't care less about learning a language. So we got to seek out those kind of people that have the aptitude and the desire. Balancing learning the language and cultural respect, I think that, I think it is, it's kind of like in Asia, the yin and the yang. There's that balance between the two. It's not either or, it's both and. And I think that's the way you have to look at it. So I think that the other thing that I think is really interesting, and you mentioned working with interpreters and translators. Often I found, particularly in Korea, but also, Thailand and Philippines and other places, that you will be using a translator, especially with a more senior person. And in fact, that senior person may speak English, but refuses to speak English with you. And I think we need to know that when we're using a linguist to communicate with somebody who does speak English, that they really have an advantage in negotiations, because they can hear you speak, they can hear the linguist speak, and while the linguist is speaking, they can frame their response to you. And while they're speaking, if you don't understand the language, you are having to wait to hear the translation. And so we should always consider, and of course, this is most important, is always assume that your counterpart can speak English. Too often we think that if they don't speak English, then we can speak English and make comments that might not be well received. just because we think they can't speak English. I mean, that's probably one of the worst mistakes that we can make. And so I think it's important to remember, particularly senior people, and more senior people are often self-conscious, and so they don't want to speak English with an accent or that is less than perfect. But in fact, they can understand everything you're saying. And so you need to be aware of that. And your linguist should be able to detect that and help you with that in case you don't figure that out. Mike, back to you.
Your thoughts, Andrew?
I'm gonna use some examples that I think illustrate Dave's excellent points. So, to amplify his points, number one, you as an American, without not speaking the language of the local country, are horribly at the mercy of your linguist. Maybe horribly is the wrong term, but you really are in awe, because so much of what we do as Americans we do get things across with body language, but you go overseas, body language is very different. So you're without even that, and you are very much at the mercy of your linguist, and that and he may not even intentionally try and mislead you or the person that you're talking to, but it can have far-reaching consequences. And sometimes what happens, and typically happens certainly with conventional forces, is that you will have a linguist who is from a different region, and there's all kinds of cultural nuances there, and he will have, even if he doesn't need to, some element of disdain for the locals. There's hierarchies that we don't even realize, and that is all brought across. So little things that you ask him to say, are not being translated in that way, and you may think that you are being very sensitive, but you're coming across as being arrogant because of the way that it's translated. So what is the solution there? There isn't a single silver bullet, but your original question was, what is first? What is culture? It's a cultural language. And I will agree with Dave and emphasize the point that you've got to emphasize language for those few guys who have both the aptitude and enthusiasm. All right. And I promised you an example, and I don't mean keep coming back to elements, my own experiences, but I think you have to illustrate things. So, case in point, deploying as an infantry, just conventional infantry battalion commander to a really crappy area of Anbar, and Anbar is a crappy area. So bad that the preceding battalion commander had been killed by a suicide bomb. And this thing about linguists, this lesson stayed with me. And that is why I made a heavy emphasis that, hey, every one Marine in every squad will learn Arabic. I don't care who it is. I don't care if it's the PFC, preferably it won't be the squad leader, because I'm going to lose this guy essentially for 5 months during the workup. Big sacrifice. I mean, this was a heavy cost, and it was much criticized at the time. I'm not, I've made many, many mistakes in my career. I'm just trying to emphasize this was one time I didn't make a mistake. So I tell these guys, and I said, the whole point was, this isn't the dirtbag in your squad. It's got to be a guy who really needs to go. And everyone said he cannot learn that level of Arabic in that time. But because we had guys who were highly enthusiastic, and they were told, this is now going to be your table of equipment weapon. This is your weapon, just like the saw gunner, you're going to be relied on to protect the squad with your language skills. And that became tremendous incentive and a point of pride. And these guys learned, we brought linguists out to the battalion, and these guys learned Arabic very quickly. And it had, as I already talked about, that knock-on effect for the rest of their squad, because they would be able to explain to their buddies stuff in the afternoon or evening, and that their buddies would never have picked up on patrols, or even before they deployed. But the other thing I didn't even realize at the time what an advantage this was that squad, when they went out on patrol, were not reliant on that one linguist. They would have that kid who could pick up enough Arabic to know what was going on, and was very happy to show that off. And the exponential effect that they had, even in, as I said, a very hostile area of Anbar, has stayed with me. So I think that illustrates, all of Dave's points. And that was a conventional unit. That was, Marines. So, But
Yeah, I understand that completely. But you know, and those interpreters are so key. When I was the Siege of SOF commander in Bosnia, I had two interpreters. One was a Bosniak and one was a Serb, and I took them with me everywhere. So I made sure that I did not get slanted viewpoints because one was a quality check on the other. It worked out well because they were friends, but I had somebody to double check for me at the same time, which hopefully we won't have to do that very often. But when we talk about the broad array of potential venues, if you will, and potential languages that we would have to be ready for, does AI or a machine learning play any role in this? Could you see where that could help? I mean, you can't underestimate the human dimension, but can that help us with adjusting to some of these areas? I mean, I'm going to a location that I have to look at on a map to find out where it is. Now I've got to plug it into some device that can help get me spooled up quickly on what's going on. Any thoughts on the role of technology in doing this?
Yeah, I think technology can be an aid. And, you know, I find myself more and more using Google Translate, you know, checking words and things like that. And I think that's useful. But, you know, I still can't, you know, imagine substituting a machine for a human being. And I think, you know, while you can translate words, you know, reading on a machine, you don't, it's just like text messaging. Now, how many times now in email that we have problems, you cannot really express tone and really express feelings, you know, through through text messages, and they're often misinterpreted, you know, an email, or, you know, and you have to go back and say, oh, I didn't really mean that. Well, that's what you wrote. And so I think AI and machine learning tools that will spit out a translated phrase or something, you know, it can be useful for practical application, but you certainly lose a lot in the nuance and understanding of what the person really means and intends to and is intending to say. So I think we should keep searching for AI. We should keep searching for machine tools, but we cannot. You know, I just can't imagine. Maybe I'm just too old and stuck in my ways, but I just cannot imagine taking the human out of the loop. I really think that you know, communication is really done between humans, and I would not ever depend on a machine to translate for me. But in a difficult situation, reading a map, trying to get directions, sure, I think there's a lot of practical application. But until that machine can interpret body language, can interpret tone and intent, I don't think you can get that without a human in the loop.
Andrew, your thoughts?
yeah, I absolutely agree with Dave. And look, we're not Luddites here. You know, I think I've seen what Dave puts out in his, you know, his daily national security briefings. I know he's a believer in AI. It's going to bring exponential advantages to us in the military, but this area is just not one. Except to provide the most basic tools. Everything that we have talked about to do with empathy and relationships, you cannot replicate with machine learning.
So I think that all of us have a special operations background, and we all recognize and have benefited from the value of linguists and of having translators with us, or having our own people who can speak the language. As we gear up for large-scale conflict, as we go for big actor conflict and near-peer competitors, how do we continue to, how do we improve the language and cultural training of the force overall? I mean, look at Abu Ghraib, the MPs. They weren't special operations folks. They were just plain old MPs from somewhere. And there was an old term that the special forces used to use called about the strategic corporal back in the 90s. Decisions are made at the lowest levels that have strategic implications. And we, in special forces, we see that all the time, but we have worked so well with our teams and so closely with our teams. we know what their strengths are. I think we have a better understanding of what people can do. But sometimes you got to know when to walk through the kill zone or let somebody walk through the kill zone. And sometimes you got to know when to pull the trigger. And how do we train other forces, all forces? I mean, the special operations, of course, needs to do this, if not more than anybody, in my opinion. But how do we train? How do we help conventional forces understand the impact of this on their mission?
Well,
Andrew.
okay, good.
I'll give Andrew the chance to go first.
Yeah. You know, we've seen time and again, and arguably now in our own country, we're seeing the effects of, you know, lack of cultural understanding at you know, the incredible knock-on effects and lack of cultural understanding can have at the lowest levels. I'm gonna tell you two things as that play into this, Mike, and you're gonna roll your eyes a little bit and say, "Oh my God, that's so trite and cliche," but then I'm going to explain a little bit more what I mean. Okay, leadership and accountability. All right. So when things go wrong, you know, at Abu Ghraib or wherever it is, or Haditha, it is in every case. When I say leadership, it is the explaining the why in terms that your audience will understand. That is a little bit easier when you're dealing with special operations guys, E5 and above, you know, all of whom maybe are in their 30s. But that doesn't exempt you from the responsibility if you have 18-year-olds. In fact, it makes it all the more acute to explain to them, hey guys, here's the deal. This is why we're going to act this way. Number one, you know, we fight with the values that we represent. We don't adopt those of our enemy. Number two, even if you don't believe number one, you're going to risk your buddies' lives. You know, if you act with disdain and ruthlessness towards the local population, and we'll be here forever and we'll never get out of here. You know, I mean, that's just an example, but explaining that, and then the more understanding, they're going to be held accountable. And what do I mean by that? When I've seen things go wrong, it's often leaders who think that they're looking after their guys. Hey man, you know, remember that the example I used earlier about erring on the side of self-defense, okay? I mean, we're so deeply steeped in the terms of force protection, but sometimes there's a clash between our love of force protection and the cultural requirements that will prevent us exacerbating a situation. Sometimes we have to get over our own culture of self-protection and say, hey dude, I know you're scared, but you're gonna have to wait a split second more to identify your threat, because guess what? I'm going to question you hard if you pull the trigger, and you're going to have to live with it if you kill the wrong person. That conversation doesn't often happen. I've heard the other conversation happen time and again. Hey man, abide by the rules of engagement. But if you think, you know, your life is in danger, then, you know, that's self-defense and pull the trigger. And that has resulted time and time again in us and them attitude and in us alienating the population. You wouldn't think that was a cultural lesson, but that is a cultural lesson. And it's not just about indigenous culture, it's about our own culture. It's about our own culture. It's about the fact that however much we think we're the good guys, there is always this implicit understanding that our lives are more important, all right? That the lives of our guys are more important than the local population. Now, you and I may, you know, struggle with that and think, well, yeah, but you know, they kind of are. But if we exude that and play into that culture, it causes huge problems. Instead of saying, hey man, if you make the wrong call, you're probably going to be held accountable. You know, you know, I don't want to make this a conversation about what's happening in the United States right now, but probably if you look at police departments that have endemic problems, I would guess there's some kind of culture in there about us and them, and hey, we're the thin blue line, and you know, hey, our lives are more important than anyone's, to include the local population. They may not state it, but it's this implicit understanding that no one in the leadership has taken the time to call them together and say, hey guys, guess what? You may risk your life on duty, and that's what you get paid to do, but you will not needlessly mistreat a member of the local population. I'm not talking specifically about the police there. I'm talking culturally about without U.S. military overseas.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, absolutely, to me. Dave, your thoughts?
Yeah, Abu Ghraib was, obviously a terrible tragedy, and and I think it was a leadership problem, organizational problem. However, there is an important cultural lesson in it, and that is misunderstanding or misappropriating culture, and thinking you can use culture to your benefit. And to that, I mean, as I understand from the reports, part of it was that people thought they were softening up prisoners for interrogation. And so they were using things that were supposedly culturally averse to the Iraqis, such as dogs and women, and treating them in undignified ways. And somehow the people there thought that violating their culture, would achieve effects that they desired, that they would, they would open up and confess and provide information. And I think that that is really a misunderstanding and misappropriation of culture, something that we need to be very aware of, because, in our attempts to learn cultural awareness and some of the trappings and everything, people that do not have good leadership or a good moral grounding may try to take that and use it in ways that have, in this case, strategic, negative effects for our nation. So I think that that's an important lesson to keep in mind. The other point that Andrew makes, and I agree with all his points, but on force protection, especially for SOF, we are dependent on the local population for our force protection. And the, part of, we really have to develop those relationships. And I'm not talking the classic hearts and minds. I'm talking about real relationships where, you are present for long periods of time and develop that mutual respect between you and your counterparts, you and the local population. And that's really, really important to do that, because that's what really enhances force protection. And I mentioned that, and Andrew's making a point about uniforms. I have a friend who said that Afghans used to look at Americans in all their kit, behind their mirrored sunglasses, helmets, body armor, gloves, weapons, as men from Mars. I mean, they were from another planet. And that is the emphasis on force protection. And I recall from friends who were in Afghanistan in 2001 and 2002, particularly in 2002, early on, SF was walking around in soft caps and sidearms, and in the population, and that they were really developing relationships. And then as we shifted our missions and the force grew larger, we really focused on force protection. Put on helmets, put on body armor. You will have a long gun wherever you go, all those kind of things. And that intimidates the population. Now, again, you have to balance force protection, and there were reasons for that. But I think you could probably draw a line between, giving an appearance of intimidation, being a man from Mars, with the perceived threats by the indigenous forces. And, you may be better off having less of a military posture or less of an aggressive posture, and being able to converse and communicate with the local population. And that might enhance your force protection. I'll stop there.
Great points. It's but as Americans, some people think we're arrogant just because we're Americans, but I think Americans are confident. I mean, we have the confidence of a democracy. We have a confidence of being from this great country. We have a lot of confidence in our fellow soldiers. We have a lot of confidence. That gets translated by a lot of people as arrogance in some cases. For instance, we talk about cultural sensitivity. I know a company whose logo is a big boar hog, and so that's all well and good wearing around in America, because that doesn't faze us. They just got a contract in Saudi Arabia. So now they're wondering how they're going to change the company logo to satisfy their new customers in Saudi Arabia, because they don't want to be culturally insensitive. But here we are. That's just kind of an American attitude of irreverence, I guess, in some ways. But we could go on and talk about this stuff for hours and hours. There's so many examples: Haiti and Bosnia and Iraq and Afghanistan. There's so many examples. But unfortunately, we don't have another hour. So if you guys don't mind, I'll ask y'all to, I'll give y'all 3 or 4 minutes to give us your concluding comments. And Andrew, how about you starting us off?
Okay, point number one, and this no one's paid me to say this in SOCOM, but you know, I agree with absolutely with Dave's implicit point at the beginning that whether you know, we have a national security strategy focused on counter DEO or on great power competition, SOF personnel, for all the reasons that we talked about, are going to play a disproportionate role, and that you know, we talked, rather than me go over again everything that we've talked about, that we've shown that language and culture have implications that go far beyond simple communication. They really are the difference between operating effectively and operating incompetently and clumsily in an environment. They aren't luxuries. They are weapons. Yeah, you know, I hate to use that term, maybe, but deploying without them would be like deploying without organic weapons. You know, SOF, as we talked about, for the reasons we have, a lot of it because of the intellect and the emotional intelligence that we size up during assessment, are ideally suited to use those weapons in all environments short of conventional war, which is likely to be where we find ourselves. Not conventional war, but in the gray zone for the foreseeable future. All right.
Dave, your thoughts?
Yes, of course, I concur with Andrew. We are on the same wavelength. I think that, you know, as I started out, I think the comparative advantages of SOF come in influence, governance, and support to indigenous forces and populations. And, you know, we just can't emphasize enough how important language is for that, either developing your own language capabilities, those within your units, or working with linguists. And it is an art, and it is and it takes training and practice, whether it's your own education for learning a language or working with linguists. I think one of the things that we benefited from, you know, for the last 2 decades of this long war, is that we have many senior leaders, conventional and SOF, who've have experiences now working and living in foreign cultures and having to deal with linguists. And so I think, you know, and I'm hopeful that as we go forward, there will be greater emphasis on language in the conventional forces, and continuing and even increasing emphasis within the special operations community. I think everybody must recognize the value of, you know, cultural awareness, cultural understanding, and cultural respect as derived through being able to speak a language. And so I think, and we're going to have to work with linguists. That's a function of, you know, it's a reality in this world. And I think Russia and China are the big threats, but they present a threat around the world and in places where SOF in particular habitually operates. And so as part of that great power competition, you know, it is really a competition for friends, partners, and allies. And it's also a competition over values. You know, our basic values that every American soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, you know, whether they say it out loud or not, they've internalized: freedom and individual liberty, liberal democracy, free market economy, and human rights. You know, those are our fundamental values that we live by, and those need to be expressed through language, through action, you know, and that's really what makes our country, you know, as powerful as it is. It's not, you know, our nuclear weapons, our submarines, our bombers, and big battalions, but it is American values. And to effectively express American values, we've got to have a language ability. And so I applaud this effort. Thank you.
Gentlemen, it's been a great honor to talk with you today. I look forward to the time that the 3 of us can sit around a table somewhere with a suspension of General Orders number 1 and consume some adult beverages. And I'm sure we can carry this on for the next 6 or 7 hours. But thanks a lot for your participation. I really appreciate it. It's been a great honor to work with y'all. And Brian, back to you.
No, thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Andrew and David, and a really great discussion. You know, as a Marine and a linguist myself, I certainly learned a lot from your comments. I was that PFC colonel that was sent off to DLI to learn Arabic and come back to the unit. So identify with a lot of what you said, and both you and David really appreciate your time. Man, wow, we covered a lot. Linguistic impacts on social influence and governance and support, cultural insights and how these are gained through language acquisition, and really the need for that at every level. Empathy to other cultures while maintaining your own attributes that give you strength. The role of technology, a linguistic aid, not a substitute. These are some of the things you guys are talking about that really struck me. Mike, any other parting thoughts before I sign us off?
No, I just think it's been a great discussion. Like I said, we could go on with this stuff for hours. There's so many examples, there's so many operations, there's so many things that personal experiences from all three of us that we could just go on and on and on. But I think it's been a great discussion, and truly it definitely leads down the path of where we're going. We definitely need cultural and language training, and special operations may lead the way, but it probably needs to be something everybody does.
Yep. Well, thanks, Mike. And this is great. Thank you again, Mike, Andrew, and David. Thank you all also to our audience. Stay tuned for more relevant conversations with ourselves, some of the people here, but with anything regarding the critical issues affecting the SOF community. Until next time, stay strong and stay healthy, folks.